Friends, it's lovely to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. The last time I was in the Sugar Club, it was to hear a bunch of hipster boys in waistcoats and their granddad's trousers play mandolins and cellos and double basses. And it's a lovely thing to be back here with a little bit less beer in my stomach. So I am going to share some poetry with you this morning, and poetry really that is trying to be poetry at the edges of the edges. How is it that we can look at, even if we think religion is at the edges, and I'm not entirely convinced it is, how is it that we think of the edges of that edge? How can we look at the story from the inside and from the outside? How is it that we can narrate narratives to do with religion and narratives to do with religious experience from the point of view of perhaps a small bit of exile, or perhaps a small bit of being, what's that word when you're sent away against your will? Being, what's that? Banished. Excommunicated. So the poetry that I'll be sharing with you kind of comes under the broad category of feed the beast. The devil shows up a lot, and so I just want to give you that as a little bit of a trigger warning in advance, that the devil shows up a lot. But not in this first poem. This first poem is a little bit of midrash about Jacob and Esau, the sons of Isaac, that troubled character Isaac. And I'm intrigued by Jacob and Esau, because when we meet them as younger men, they're these, one's hairy, one's smooth, one's ravenous, one's scheming, one is favored by one parent, one is favored by the other. There's this extraordinary sense of distance and conflict between them. One seems more like a primal animal, and the other seems more like a political sophisticate. Until they meet again, generations later. One comes back with a limp, and suddenly these two patriarchs meet each other. And their reconciliation, and it is described as a reconciliation, their reconciliation is extraordinary and exquisite, and like the best kinds of reconciliations, very, very short. Because short and temporary reconciliations are the ones that seem to be the easiest to engage in the gesture of. We find out nothing more about what happened to them later on. So here's a sonnet. I've been engaging with sonnets lately, and here's a sonnet called Jacob and Esau. Although I might call it something different soon, I don't know. I change the titles of these things all the time. So Jacob and Esau. One day I repented my resentment because I'd forgotten to repeat it. For a while, no, for a long while, it was like a prayer rising to the skies morning after morning, like a siren that wouldn't quiet. And then I remembered other things. The way I walk lighter these days, the way you never knew my story of divorce, the way I am tired of being forced among the new, the way I miss having someone to speak to about things I don't need to explain, the way we shared a name. So I decided. I took a flight and hung around the areas where we used to meet. I loitered with intent. I was hungry with hope but couldn't eat alone. I missed your home, the smell your body was, and even though we're grown now, I missed you, your wrestle, your snoring breath. And when I saw you changed too. So much behind us we didn't need to name. I touched your arm. You wrapped it round me, brothers again. When I was 11, I asked my parents for a Bible for Christmas, and they got me an Old Testament and a New Testament. And the first thing I did was to open up in the New Testament and see was there a picture of the devil. And there was a picture of the devil at the time when Jesus goes into the desert. And this devil was sky blue, an extraordinary bright blazing sky blue with tail and hoofs and bright blue eyes. And it started an intrigue in me about how do we understand the theological understandings about the devil in the New Testament. I have a particular kind of relationship with the devil, which I'll tell you about in a while. But this, for me, was a very serious question. It wasn't just a kind of a teenage question, even though Oliver Conlon in my class said that if you said Our Father backwards into the mirror, that you turn into the devil. And he did, apparently, he told us all. I walked home praying the Hail Mary Oscaelga over and over and over again in the 2 miles home from school. It didn't stop the devil following me. So I take the narratives about Jesus and the tempter that you find particularly in Matthew and in Luke. It's referenced briefly in Mark, not mentioned at all in John. I take those temptations seriously because, like, if somebody, I have no interest in heroin. If somebody came up to me and said, Pádraig, do you want some heroin? I'd say, no thanks. That's not a temptation. That's a disinterest. If we are to take the question of Jesus in the desert seriously, we must wonder, why were those the things where something was getting under his skin? Why those? Seriously, why those? What was going on that something was happening there that he was like, maybe. And I think it's a little bit too easy to think about this sky blue devil with bright blazing red eyes. I think the devil looks a lot like us. It looks like a part of us that says, take a shortcut. Work your way into something that'll be beneficial to you. Nobody's looking. So here's a poem, which I haven't titled yet. And so if you have any good ideas, you can tell me. It's also a sonnet. I think I'm trying to exorcise some sonnets from me. And this is addressed to Jesus. Because you too struggled, you went into the wild with nothing to shield you from the light. You learned to shade your eyes from the sun. You sweated in your sleep in the heat of the day. You made up stories to waste time and to keep the fear away. It didn't work. You wrestled with a devil more subtle than the one you'd read about. He didn't lurk in the corner of your cave or scream at you with a night blue mouth. He didn't roast you or launch himself out at you all bat wings and hooves. He was always with you, but you didn't see that till the end. You'd been worrying about food and flight and fancy and how to be who you were. You'd been worrying about prayer and the way a man should care about his country when his country's a plaything for a despot. You'd been worrying about thirst and endings. In a dream, there was a bright stream flowing just for you. And when you woke, you knew the devil in the details. And then you saw him and yourself. So ultimately, I'm interested in stories that happen at the edges of ourselves. Stories that bring us to the point where we think, I think I'm at the end of the rope, or I think I'm off the rope. Stories where you think, I never thought my life would bring me to this stage. The certainty that I thought I had, even if I didn't think I had a lot, I didn't think I'd be here. And I think sometimes we call that place hell. And so I have a little poem called Go to Hell. I do bear the accolade of having scored the highest score that the Pontifical University had ever seen on an essay. And I wasn't a high scorer in general, but I did happen to get the highest score that the Pontifical University had ever seen when I was considering the priesthood. And the essay was on hell. And my supervisor, Father John Redford, said to me, "It is an unusual thing to score highly in." I blamed it on a childhood love of Dante's Inferno. But I think to take an idea of hell seriously, I think to take that very seriously, we need not to think about the future or what happens after death. We need to think about the present, because I don't believe in the future or the past. I believe in something right now. I believe that there are things that can happen right now that can change the way we relate to each other. That's why I get engaged in the small hells known as conflict, the small hells known as the troubles, the small hells known as human experience of the deepest kind of disenfranchisement from each other in a small society like the north of Ireland. And so I need to have a theology of hell, and I need to have an understanding of hell, because it's right here. And so, hence, I have a deep interest in the story of Jesus and hell. And here is a poem called Go to Hell. He is called to hell, this man. He is called to glory. He knows well those twisted ways and those who've lost their story. He is called to clay, this man. He is called to yearning. He has heard of hidden streams that heal those tired of burning. He's searching out those raised in hell. He wants to know the things they know. He believes in dreamland where the ragged people go. He is called to quiet now. He is called to silence, to squat down on the breaking ground with those who've swallowed violence. He is called to anguished thoughts. He is called to flowers, to find in hell's own lonely fury that which no flame devours. I saw him on the midway path. I saw he carried two things only. On his way to hell, this man, he is called to story. I've always loved counting. I've always been somebody who's counted all kinds of things. How many chords I knew when I started playing the guitar at 11, how many friends I was when I was an unpopular young fella, not very many. Because poetry and gymnastics don't necessarily recommend you to schools in rural Cork full of lads. Just a little tip in case any of you were wondering about how to make friends. I've always loved anniversaries as well, and today, and this is entirely true, today is the 24th anniversary of my first public exorcism, so hence my interest in the devil. So I'm writing on a sequence of sonnets. A sonnet, by the way, is 14 lines. It's an Italian form that the English poetic tradition took through William Shakespeare. And a sonnet needs to have a volta. A sonnet makes a presentation and then turns. Volta is the Italian, same place that we get a revolt or revolve, something that turns on itself, a little pirouette of idea. And so a sonnet is supposed to put something out and then do a little pirouette in front of you. And classic Italian ones do them at line 9, so you have 8 and 6, whereas classic English ones under Shakespeare do them at line 13. I'm not a classicist, so I put them in wherever the hell they are. And so I've been working on a little sequence called 7 Deadly Sonnets, which doesn't work in Dublin. It works everywhere else because for those of you not from Dublin, in Dublin, deadly means absolutely fantastic. So you'd say, what was the wedding like? Deadly. And everybody goes, oh, fantastic, well done. So 7 Deadly Sonnets doesn't really work in Dublin. So just pretend you're from somewhere with a little bit of culture. I can say that because I'm from the People's Republic of Cork. So, and like most of the best people from the People's Republic of Cork, I left there as soon as I could. Anyway. So I'm only going to read 4 of the 7 Deadly Sonnets because that's all that's written. And these are entirely true and actually nowhere near as bad as things were. So, 7 Deadly Sonnets, the first. I wish you weren't American, but you were. I wish you didn't seek the devil, but you did. I wish I hadn't been there, but I was frightened in a corner, crouched in a chair, where you pressed hands onto my back and screamed, come out, you demon, shadow of the devil, leave this child alone. You saw yourself as priest and prophet, bondage breaker, liberator. You saw yourself as working for the maker of the world, speaking truth to evil where you saw it, and you saw it in me, because I had confessed to you that inside of me, within me, was homosexuality. And so you screamed holy terror at me, seeking a demon that wasn't there, and people gathered round and prayed in tongues, or read from Revelation, or said, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And I cowered down and said, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I wish you weren't allowed, but you were. I wished you weren't alive and was frightened at the violence in me. I wish that you'd be silenced, but Jesus was, and I was, and inside of me, a storm rose, a fury, a muzzled terror swelling through me, waiting to be freed. The second was with an American louder than the first. He burst into the room all power and glory and fish stickers on his chest. He held his hand out to the crowd and called us friends and said that he had a message from the guest of every human breath. Someone told him, someone said that the fella in the corner had a devil that wouldn't budge, so he called men to stand around and pray for me with hands and muttered words in languages I didn't understand. Nothing happened. I snuggled a little closer with my shame. When I heard his name in the story of a scandal, his defense that the women he'd sexted on the phone had only been to help him, to understand him, that they hadn't gone that far, that they had mostly talked of loneliness and love, I found some truth in what he said. I'd seen him beat his firstborn son once. He laid those hands on me later, saying that his touch could heal me. I could feel his heartbeat in his fingers. Heal me, heal me. The third exorcism, because the first two had been unsuccessful, I was told to do on myself and sent into a room by myself. And here's the poem, the sonnet, the third. There's part of me still in that room. It is warm and it is empty. There are strange sounds outside, and I am not allowed outside until what's inside me is behind me. I'm beside myself with fear, and I don't know what to do. I speak to the selves in me. Come out, I say. Come out, come out. Speaking to a devil I'm too frightened to find. All of this was a long time ago, in a place I've not seen since. And since then, I've had many healings, many demons fleeing from me, many devils rising up in me. I've spat curses and cures at the night that made me. I've sat through lectures, and I'm more sure than I ever thought I could be that there was something inside me, something moving me, something crawling up inside me, something evil, something wrong, something that longed to hear me speaking to it, something that would cut my throat until I spoke it, until I made it real, until I shouted from the steeple that inside me is what's inside me. All the chaos of my making, all the fury of my masculinity, all the need and heart and hunger, all the waste and wonder, all the howling, all the legions, all the names and demons, gods and devils of the world. Because for me, what I think I've come to realize is that growing up means coming to terms with the fact that you do have demons in you, but nothing that's so easily exorcised just by some madman with a prayer on his mouth. There was a particular phenomenon that happened in the 1990s that involved a city in Canada called Toronto. And I had never really spent much time thinking about Toronto until suddenly people spoke about this church in Toronto where things were happening and you could go there and get prayed for and all kinds of things would happen and this visitation seemed to be happening. And in case you're concerned, this isn't a poem taking the piss out of that, because I think devotion comes in all kinds of forms, and even if it's peculiar, sometimes I'm more curious about what's happening on the inner journey than the outer journey. But here is a poem, a sonnet, the final of the 7 deadly sonnets, which is called Feed the Beast, which is about Toronto. I never went. There were too many people who went to Toronto. They went in droves. They drove their cars to Dublin from Cork, from Belfast, from Connacht, from Drumcondra, and left on a wing and a prayer for more, more, more. They sat 2 by 2 in rows, flying west toward a sun that wouldn't set. They stayed in hotels near the airport and made pilgrimage to the place of visitation, hoping for a wing, a hoof, a flank, a touch of what is so near to us to hear us. They didn't come back alone. One brought a hound in his hand luggage, a hound that sounded out his grief like a nighttime. One brought a bullock that bellowed from the barrel of his chest like a devil. One brought a lion. Its roar was rare and deadly. They all came back sore and hungry, their bodies wrecked from taming beasts they didn't realize they'd need to feed. One of the things that really strikes me from reflecting on some of those charismatic experiences was looking at the way within which people were able to let go of themselves. It was like a liturgical version of a mosh pit. And a mosh pit is true because there are needs inside of us that need to be danced out, that need to be freaked out of us, that need to be shaken from our limbs, and physicality is what does it. And part of my reflection on those times is to look at quite how amazing it was that something gave people so much freedom to be able to shake and roar and bellow, and all because there are beasts in us needing to be fed. I'm only at the start of my talk, by the way. But I do have a clock here that'll keep me quiet. One of the things I think that going through all of those exorcisms, and it was followed up by a year of reparative therapy, which was a much different hell. I grew to hate the number 16 bus as a result. One of the things that that teaches you is it teaches you what it means to find meaning at the edges of yourself. And so it's no surprise to me that I found myself moving to Belfast, and beginning to work with the Corrymeela community, and beginning to work with people who had been bereaved through bombs, with people who had been traumatized through recruitment into an agency at the age perhaps of 14 or 15, found themselves with a gun in their hands at 17, having murdered somebody at 18, and then in prison till they were 36, and then out of prison and going, what the hell do I do now? And full of grief and anxiety and fury at the people who recruited you, and perhaps also a sense of loyalty to the political cause that moved you, full of all these tensions inside yourself. And so I was asked would I be poet in residence with Corrymeela. For about 8 or 9 years I sat in rooms of people who had been distanced from themselves and from each other. And one time in a room, an argument broke out as to what the correct verb to use is when somebody has died as a result of your actions. One person said murder, another person said no, I didn't murder anybody. People died. And somebody else said it was a war, it's a conflict. Somebody said I took a life. It's a strange room to be arguing about the conjugation of a verb in. You don't think about that when you're learning your grammar in school, that this stuff matters. It's serious, it's worrying, and it's frightening. And so there's a very short poem here called The Pedagogy of Conflict that picks up on one argument that people had in that room, because in one particular room, somebody had said that they only ever shot legitimate targets, and so hence they wouldn't use the word murder for their actions. And then somebody else said, well, that must have made me a legitimate target when I was 8, because people from your group shot at me when I was 8. So here's a short poem, which is the third of 3, called The Pedagogy of Conflict. When I was a child, I learned to count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But these days I've been counting lives, so I count 1 life, 1 life, 1 life, 1 life, 1 life. Because each time is the first time that that life has been taken. Legitimate target has 16 letters and 1 long, abominable space between 2 dehumanizing words. I was sitting around a table once with some people, and there was a young fella there in his mid-20s. This is only a few years ago, and he said something about the Troubles. And somebody else around the table, who I'm calling in this poem that's coming up, the Peace Man, who was a very, very well-known, internationally recognized broker of peace. This Peace Man said to this young man, "You're too young to know about the Troubles." And so here's a poem that I wrote after this. The poem is called Not Yet. "You're too young to know about the Troubles," the Peace Man said. And the young man said, "Father shot dead, mother fell apart, brother fell into himself, other brother sent to live with others, and me, I smothered everything. I was farmed around, and now years later we have found ourselves back beneath a shared and troubled ceiling." Not yet. No one's too young to know about the Troubles. In Irish, which I spoke growing up and still speak, tribloids is a word for bereavement. So sometimes people who don't have Irish might say, "God, the Troubles sounds like an awful twee postman pat kind of way to describe 30 years of murder in a tiny society like what's north of the border." But when you hear it through the lens of, or through the auditory lens of Irish, you hear in a tribloid the bereavements. And not that any word would be the right word to describe hell. Ultimately, I'll call it whatever people want. If they want to call it the conflict, the war, the troubles, it doesn't matter to me what it's named. Language will always fail when you're describing hell. Brexit has introduced a new public discussion for us in the North, and as to whether there'll be a new Ireland, a united Ireland. Will Brexit move this back and forth? And while I certainly do, I'm a nationalist, I'm an Irish speaker, I very definitely don't feel like I'm a foreigner in the North, so I personally welcome that. The bigger question for me is, how will we live with each other anyway? Because changing borders, we know, gives no solution. The Irish word for border, teoran, means limitation. And so my curiosity is, how will we live with our limitations, no matter where those limitations are, whether the border's in one place or the next? How will we live with the limitations in ourselves, in our political, social, and religious narratives? And so I'm curious about what negotiation looks like, and particularly what negotiation looks like when there's a deep sense of disenfranchisement, when some people say, we've hurt more than you, we've been hurt more than you. So there's a poem here called Postcards to the Centre. It used to be called Postcards from the Edge, but then I realized that was a film, isn't that right? I didn't know about such a film, which apparently makes me a failure as a gay, because Barbara Streisand's in it. But anyway, add that to my list of failures. And here's a poem called Postcards to the Centre, which is not about a film. To the centre from the edge. This circle's marked out by the dredges of your justice, and at these edge-place ruts, we eat the crusts of hope. Must this circle never end? Please, can we shape a new shape, shaped a bit like you and shaped like me, shaped like how we think that things might be if things were not the way they've been? And yes, I know that that's a dreamer's dream, but sometimes dreams, like nightmares, can be real. To the centre from the edge, we're still here. If you drown out our voices, you will not drown out your fear. We're still here. To the centre from the edge, we will live with you if you will live with us. You go first and then we'll follow. You start off today and we'll catch up tomorrow. To the centre from the edge, can we lay down arms, refuse to fire them, even though we've sold our right arms to acquire them? If we stop before we're finished, will we emerge unfinished or defeated? Can we carve out some radius of peace, and will we need to fight to keep it? To the centre from the edge, we describe the centre by our edge place habitation. We inscribe the middle with invisible lamentation. Now we're issuing an invitation. Drink our tears, and we'll drink yours. Show your fears, and we'll show ours. I did a few degrees in theology, and I'm terrible at philosophy. I just don't understand it. I blame that on the fact that the Irish language doesn't have a good way of describing the abstract, but mostly I think it's just that I'm not very clever at philosophy. But what I really love in theology is narrative. I love the fact that we have a tradition that we inherit from Hebrew Bible and then into the Christian texts also, of a way that describes story. And there's an understanding in narrative theology that says that the author of a story cannot control a story's power to reveal. And that is a frightening statement, because it means that we're always saying far more than we think we're saying. It means that we're always at the possibility of ourselves being revealed to us by the stories we tell about us, the parts of ourselves where story is what's telling us rather than us telling story. And so I have a couple of poems that I'll use to finish off with about narrative theology. The first one is actually dedicated to my the fellow who was my therapist. When I moved away, I had been to reparative therapy, an experience that I don't even like putting the word therapy in with, which was an awful experience that embedded shame in me on a level that is pathological. And I then went to find somebody who actually had a qualification, which was a really good idea. And then the final one is a prayer. I'm opening it up here so I don't get lost. Here we are. So narrative theology, it's dedicated to Peter Saunders. And I said to him, are there answers to all of this? And he said, the answer is in a story, and the story is being told. And I said, but there is so much pain. And she answered plainly, pain will happen. And then I said, will I find meaning? And they said, you will find meaning where you give meaning. The answer is in a story, and the story isn't finished. Here's narrative theology. Open up this way of listening to almighty echoes in the caverns of my readings and the hillsides of my ways. a new way of listening to the order and the chaos, so that a mess can carry beauty and a yearning find its source. May the rivers of our aching know their force and mend their rending. Oh, the nighttime of our longing waits for morning, waits for dawn. The echo of a voice finds room within my rooms, finds voice within my feeling, finds calm within my prayer. Oh, my lifetime, oh, my waiting, oh, my safe way through my caves. Oh, my Jesus in my nighttime, oh, my walking on the waves. Real Mahakov.